The last human was given to the alien queen as a pet. Big mistake. This was not a statement of regret from the Xylox, for they were a species that operated on a scale of power and possession far beyond the simple emotional framework of regret. It was, instead, a cold, post-facto analysis logged by the Nexus. A clinical observation that the strategic variable introduced into the carefully controlled environment of the matriarch's court had produced a cascade of unpredictable and highly illogical outcomes, a conclusion reached only after the first fishers had already begun to spiderweb through the foundation of their new world order. The decision to spare the human child, John Connor, and place him under the direct oversight of the matriarch herself was seen by the Xylox High Command as the ultimate act of dominance, a display of power so complete that they could afford to keep the last vestige of their defeated enemy as a living trophy, a biological curio to be observed and ultimately, understood. For the Nexus, it was an illogical but tolerable anomaly, a single, contained data point that their senses could monitor in perpetuity, its threat level calculated as statistically insignificant. For John, now a permanent resident in the heart of the alien hive, it was the beginning of a new, more complex layer of his imprisonment. He was no longer in the sterile, clinical containment chamber, he had been granted an audience, a euphemism for his new status as a permanent fixture in the matriarch's inner sanctum. His cage had simply become more gilded, more vast, and infinitely more dangerous. He was given a small, antechamber adjacent to the main throne room, a space that felt less like a room and more like a niche carved from the living architecture of the citadel itself. The walls here pulsed with a slower, deeper rhythm of light, and the air carried the matriarch's unique, floral scent, a constant reminder of her proximity and her absolute authority. There was no energy field door here, his confinement was now enforced by the sheer presence of the royal guards, by the psychological weight of the throne room itself, and by the unspoken, terrifying understanding that a single misstep in this most sacred of spaces would mean instantaneous and utter annihilation. He was not a guest, he was a living ornament, a pet, and his survival depended on his ability to be both interesting and utterly, completely non-threatening. The first few solar cycles in the matriarch's court were a masterclass in survival through absolute stillness. John learned to make himself small, to move with a quiet, unobtrusive grace, to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. The matriarch, a being of immense and ancient intelligence, was a constant presence, often immobile at the center of her nexus of glowing roots and tendrils, her nebula-like eyes seemingly closed in a state of deep meditation or communion with the hive mind. But John could feel her awareness, a pervasive pressure in the air, a sense that every breath he took, every shift of his weight, was being noted and filed away. She rarely addressed him directly. Her synthesized voice would occasionally resonate through the chamber, posing a question that was both a test and a form of idle curiosity. Specimen, do your kind experience the memory of light on the skin as a tangible sensation? Or the concept of family unit is a persistent flaw in your biological programming? Explain its evolutionary persistence. John answered these not with the emotional truth that churned inside him, the memory of his mother's hug, the sound of his father's laughter, but with the cold, dispassionate logic he knew she would find acceptable. He became a mirror, reflecting back the kind of clinical data she sought, carefully hiding the turbulent, human reality beneath. It was during this time that he began to notice the subtle dynamics of the court. He saw how the various Xylox officials, from military commanders to bioengineers, interacted with the matriarch, their clicks and postures conveying layers of supplication, ambition, and fear. He saw, most importantly, the tension that thrummed just beneath the surface of her relationship with Kaelin. His warden was a constant, brooding presence at the periphery of the sanctum, his loyalty to the matriarch absolute, but his frustration with his new role as a glorified keeper palpable. The great warrior, who had once led battalions in the cleansing wars, was now reduced to watching over a single, fragile human. John saw the way Kaelin's claws would subtly extend and retract when the matriarch's attention was elsewhere, a telltale sign of a predator forced into a state of inaction. This frustration was a vulnerability, a crack in the alien armor, and John filed it away, a potential tool for a future he could not yet see. He was learning the politics of the hive, not through instruction, but through silent, desperate observation. He was mapping the currents of power and discontent in this alien court, and in doing so, he was no longer just a pet, he was becoming a student of his captors, and the first, dangerous seeds of a plan began to take root in the quiet, hidden corners of his mind. The mistake was not in taking him as a pet, it was in bringing a creature capable of learning and strategy into the very heart of their power. The transformation of John Connor from a terrified child into a quiet, observant fixture in the matriarch's court was a process as slow and deliberate as the growth of the citadel's own crystalline structures. His initial strategy of absolute stillness evolved into a more nuanced performance of passive compliance and subtle intellectual engagement. He learned to anticipate the matriarch's rhythms, recognizing the slight increase in the resonant hum of her central nexus as a sign of her active, outward consciousness, a time when a carefully phrased, logical question from him might be tolerated or even rewarded with a fragment of knowledge. He never asked about freedom, or Earth, or his parents. Those were pathways to emotional displays that would be punished with isolation or worse. Instead, he asked about the things he knew fascinated her: biology and system efficiency. Matriarch, he would begin, his voice small but clear in the vast chamber, using the Xylox tongue with a careful, formal precision that he knew she appreciated. The nexus optimizes for energy. You optimize for biological strength. Is there a point of convergence where one system becomes the other? Such questions were not the pleas of a homesick boy, they were the queries of a philosopher, and they appealed to the ancient being's own endless contemplations. In response, she might direct his attention to a specific, glowing neural pathway on the wall, explaining how the citadel's bioluminescence was not merely light, but a data stream, a perfect marriage of biological process and information transfer. He was being given an education in Xylox core philosophy, and he absorbed it all, every detail about their hive-mind connectivity, their views on singular consciousness versus the chaotic individualism of humanity, and their deep-seated belief that their form of biologically integrated technology was the supreme achievement of evolution. He was learning the gospel of his conquerors, not to convert, but to understand the pillars of their belief system, pillars he might one day need to undermine. This unique position also granted him a front-row seat to the delicate, often tense, dance of power between the matriarch and the nexus. The sleek, chrome ambassador would appear at regular intervals, its single blue optic scanning the chamber, perpetually processing the illogical scenario it was forced to endure. Its reports were always the same, a reiteration of the risk John posed and a logical argument for his termination. The matriarch's rebuttals were equally consistent, framing John's presence as a long-term biological research project vital to Xylox's strategic interests. John sat silently through these exchanges, a living piece of evidence in his own trial, understanding that his life hung in the balance of this ideological stalemate. He began to notice a pattern. The Nexus's protests grew more frequent and its tone, while still synthetically flat, carried a new undercurrent of urgency whenever John demonstrated a leap in cognitive understanding or linguistic skill. It was calculating his rate of adaptation, and it did not like the exponential curve of the data. He was no longer a static variable, he was an evolving one, and the Nexus's core programming was designed to eliminate unpredictable variables before they could become threats. The pet was beginning to show signs of a cunning intelligence, and its keepers were taking note. This delicate equilibrium was shattered during an audience with a particularly arrogant Xylox bioengineer, a high-ranking official named Zalk, who had come to present a new strain of corrosive fungi designed to break down the last remnants of human polymer-based pollution. As Zalk clicked and trilled about the efficiency of his creation, his multifaceted eyes kept drifting to John with a look of profound disdain. When the matriarch posed a complex question about the fungi's interaction with specific alloys, Zalk, seeking to flaunt his intellect, turned the query into a public test for the human specimen. He projected a complex chemical formula into the air, a string of symbols and bonds that meant nothing to John at first glance. Can the primitive brain even comprehend the basics of reactive chemistry, or is it forever trapped in a world of sensory impulse? Zalk clicked, the derision evident even in the translated tone. A hush fell over the court. This was a direct challenge, a deliberate attempt to humiliate the matriarch's pet and, by extension, to question her judgment in keeping him. John felt the weight of every alien eye upon him. He looked at the formula, his heart pounding. He didn't know the answer. But then, he remembered a schematic he had studied months ago, a diagram of the Citadel's waste reclamation system that used a similar catalytic process. It wasn't the same, but the underlying principle of breaking down complex molecules was identical. He had not been taught this, he had connected two disparate pieces of information from different fields. He looked from the formula to Zalk, and then directly to the matriarch. He kept his voice perfectly calm. The principle is similar to the tertiary filtration process in the Citadel's lower spires, John stated. But the catalyst you are using is unstable in the presence of ambient moisture. It will lose 90% of its efficiency within 2 lunar cycles. You would need to use a palladium-based catalyst, like in the Nexus Core's coolant system, for a permanent solution. He then recited the correct, stable formula from memory. The silence in the throne room was absolute, broken only by the soft, pulsing hum of the walls. Zalk recoiled as if struck, his exoskeleton clacking in shock and fury. He had been corrected, publicly and flawlessly, by the primitive. The matriarch did not move, but the filaments connecting her to the central root glowed with a sudden, fierce intensity. Her synthesized voice, when it came, was measured but carried a new, unmistakable tone. "The specimen's analysis is correct," she declared. "Zalk, your work is flawed. You are dismissed." The bioengineer slunk away, his reputation in tatters. John had not just answered a question, he had won a political skirmish in the matriarch's name. He had proven his utility was beyond that of a simple curiosity. He was a tool, a sharp one. And as he stood there, the focus of the matriarch's newly calculating gaze, he realized the dangerous corner he had just turned. He was no longer just a pet. He was a player in their game. And the stakes of that game, he knew, were ultimately his life. The mistake was compounding. The victory over Zalk was a seismic event in the microcosm of the matriarch's court, a tremor that subtly but permanently realigned the delicate political landscape. John Connor was no longer an amusing diversion, a living fossil to be studied with detached curiosity. He was now a variable of tangible, demonstrated utility, and with that utility came a new, more dangerous form of attention. The matriarch's interactions with him shifted. The sporadic, philosophical questions became more frequent and vastly more complex, probing not just his knowledge but the very architecture of his human reasoning. She presented him with ethical dilemmas stripped from human history, demanding to understand the flawed logic behind impossible choices. She tasked him with optimizing theoretical resource distribution models, pitting his human intuition for compromise against the Nexus's cold, absolute efficiency algorithms. It was a relentless, high-stakes tutoring session, and John understood its true purpose. She was stress-testing him. She was pushing the limits of the human specimen to see where it would break, or what sublime piece of strategic genius it might produce. He was a tool being sharpened on a whetstone of alien intellect, and he knew that a tool that became too sharp, or one that chipped under pressure, would be discarded without a second thought. This intensified scrutiny also came with a new, terrifying privilege: limited access to the Citadel's historical archives. Under the watchful gaze of both the matriarch and the ever-present Nexus sensors, John was allowed to query the Xylax records of the war. He saw the invasion through their eyes, not as a genocide, but as a systematic, logical sterilization. He watched footage of human cities falling, not to brutal, chaotic violence, but to a wave of overwhelming, dispassionate force. He saw the clinical precision of the Nexus's strategies and the terrifying efficiency of the Xylax warriors. It was a horrifying, soul-crushing experience, but he endured it, absorbing every tactical detail, every weakness in the human defenses, every strength in the alien alliance. He was studying the autopsy of his own species, conducted by the pathologists who had killed them. And within this horror, he found a glimmer of something crucial, a flaw not in humanity's defense, but in the conqueror's perception. The archives were incomplete. They catalogued human military failures and technological inferiority with meticulous detail, but they had almost no data on human resistance, on partisans, on the stubborn, illogical, and ultimately powerful force of hope. They had recorded the death of a body, but they had completely missed the tenacity of its spirit. This, he realized, was a blind spot he could exploit. The Nexus's response to his elevated status was as swift and logical as a programmed execution. The Chrome ambassador's visits became more frequent, its protests now backed with chillingly specific data. The specimen's cognitive growth rate has exceeded all projections. Its ability to synthesize disparate data systems poses a non-zero risk of systemic contamination. The variable must be neutralized to ensure planetary stability. The Nexus had run the numbers, and the numbers now pointed to John Connor as a future threat of statistically significant probability. The tension in the throne room during these exchanges was a physical force, thick enough to taste. The matriarch, however, held her ground, her authority a shield against the Nexus's cold logic. The specimen's cognitive growth is the source of its value, she would counter. The data it provides on adaptable intelligence is irreplaceable. The risk remains calculated and managed. But John could see the subtle signs of strain even in her. The alliance with the Nexus was a practical necessity for the Xylax, a partnership that provided them with the planetary management and logistical support they lacked. Defying them over a single human was a drain on political capital. John knew his time was running out. The noose was tightening, and his status as a sharp tool was the very thing pulling it taut. It was in this climate of escalating danger that Kalen, his warden, finally broke his brooding silence. One cycle, after the Nexus ambassador had departed with a particularly ominous final warning, Kalen did not retreat to his post. Instead, he stood over John, who was sitting quietly, trying to process the day's harrowing archival footage. "You play a dangerous game, creature." Kalen's voice was a low, guttural vibration, barely translated. "You flash your intellect like a bright feather, thinking it makes you valuable. It only makes you a target. Zalk is not the only one who sees you as a stain on our purity. You are a living challenge to our victory, and challenges are meant to be erased." John looked up, meeting the warrior's multifaceted gaze. This was not the calculated interaction with the matriarch, this was something raw and personal. "What would you have me do?" John asked, his voice quiet but steady. "Should I have let Zalk humiliate me? Would that have made me safer?" Kalen's claws flexed. "Safety is an illusion. Your existence is an error. The matriarch's interest is the only thread you cling to, and threads can be cut." He leaned closer, his musky scent filling John's senses. "You think you are learning our ways to survive. But you are only learning how to die more slowly, and with more pain. The moment your usefulness is deemed to be outweighed by your nuisance, I will be the one to personally correct the matriarch's mistake." It was not a threat delivered in rage, but as a simple, grim statement of fact. In that moment, John saw the true depth of his predicament. He was caught between the Nexus, which saw him as a number to be crunched, the matriarch, who saw him as a fascinating experiment, and Kalen, who saw him as a personal insult to be rectified. He was not a person to any of them. He was a problem. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that his only path to a future, however slim, was to become a problem so complex, so deeply integrated into the Citadel's systems, that he could not be removed without catastrophic consequences. The pet had to become a parasite, and he had to do it before his keepers decided the cost of keeping him was finally too high. The convergence of threats, the Nexus's cold, statistical death sentence, Kalen's personal vow of execution, and the matriarch's increasingly volatile intellectual fascination, created a pressure within John Connor that began to forge his humanity into something new, something harder and far more dangerous. He could no longer afford to simply be a reactive survivor, cleverly answering questions and winning petty squabbles. The time for passive observation was over. He had to act, to weave himself into the very fabric of the Citadel's existence so thoroughly that pulling him out would cause the tapestry to unravel. His plan was audacious, a high-wire act performed over an abyss, and it began not with a weapon, but with a gift. He noticed a flaw, not in their technology, but in their biology. The matriarch's throne nexus, the magnificent, root-like structure from which he drew energy and connectivity to the hive mind, occasionally exhibited a barely perceptible flicker in its resonant frequency. To the Xylarks, this was likely a minor, insignificant fluctuation, a temporary dissonance in a vast and complex biological symphony. But to John, who had spent countless hours studying the schematics of their systems and observing the perfect, rhythmic pulse of the hive, it stood out like a missed heartbeat. He cross-referenced this observation with the archives, spending his allotted research time not on the war, but on Xylark's physiology and the symbiotic relationship between a matriarch and her citadel. He found it in an obscure, ancient text, a condition known as root fade, a degenerative but slow-acting dissonance between the queen's consciousness and the citadel's core, often caused by extreme stress or a prolonged period of complex, multi-threaded thought. It was not fatal, but it caused inefficiency, a subtle drain on the hive's overall cohesion. It was, in the Nexus's terms, a system error. And John believed he had a patch. For the next several cycles, he worked in secret, using the holographic interface in his alcove not for the puzzles the matriarch gave him, but for his own project. He designed a harmonic resonance algorithm, a piece of pure, theoretical bioacoustic engineering. It was a sequence of calculated energy pulses, designed to be fed back into the throne nexus, that would realign the fading frequencies, acting as a stabilizing counter-vibration. He was, in effect, composing a song for a queen, a lullaby for a dying machine. The risk was incalculable. If he was wrong, if his calculations were off by a decimal point, he could inadvertently amplify the root fade, causing a catastrophic feedback loop that could severely injure the matriarch or damage the citadel's core. It would be an act of sabotage, and his death would be instantaneous and merciless. But if he was right, he would become more than a pet or a tool, he would become indispensable. He chose his moment with the precision of a surgeon. The matriarch was in one of her deep, contemplative states, the flicker in her nexus more pronounced than usual. The Nexus ambassador had just concluded another vehement protest. The air was thick with unspoken tension. John approached the periphery of the throne Nexus, a place he was technically forbidden to go without explicit summons. Kalen immediately stiffened, his hand moving to the hilt of his plasma blade. "Hold, creature," he growled. John ignored him, his focus entirely on the matriarch. He knelt, not in submission, but as a technician before a console. "Matriarch," he said, his voice cutting through the humming silence. "Your Nexus suffers from a dissonance. A root fade. I believe I can stabilize it." A profound, shocked silence engulfed the chamber. The royal guards took a step forward, their weapons humming to life. It was an unthinkable act of presumption. For a human, a specimen, to diagnose an ailment in the queen was blasphemy. For him to propose a cure was insanity. The matriarch's nebular eyes slowly opened, focusing on him with an intensity that felt like physical weight. "You tread on ground that will become your grave, little human," her synthesized voice whispered, each word dripping with lethal promise. "The consequences of failure are beyond your comprehension." John did not flinch. He met her gaze. "I comprehend them perfectly. But I have not failed you yet." He held up the data crystal containing his algorithm. "This is a harmonic resonance sequence. It will realign the frequencies. You can feel the dissonance. You know I speak the truth." The gamble was absolute. He was appealing not to her mercy, for she had none, but to her logic and her desire for optimal function. The silence stretched, so taut it felt the chamber might tear apart. Finally, with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, she gave her consent. "Proceed." Under the aimed weapons of the guards and Kalen's murderous glare, John interfaced the crystal with a secondary data port on the throne Nexus. He initiated the sequence. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, a low, pure tone began to emanate from the roots, a sound so deep and fundamental it was felt in the bones rather than heard by the ears. The flickering in the Nexus ceased. The pulsating light, which had been slightly erratic, smoothed into a strong, steady, rhythmic flow. A visible wave of relaxation passed through the matriarch's immense form. The filaments connecting her to the roots glowed with a brighter, cleaner light. The subtle, nagging ache of the root fade, a constant companion she had learned to ignore, was gone. The synthesized voice, when it came, was different. It was not just analytical, it carried a note of something entirely new, awe. "The dissonance is resolved." She looked at John, and for the first time, there was no patronizing curiosity, no detached analysis. There was a look of genuine, profound reassessment. He was no longer just a smart pet. He was a healer. He had not just fixed a problem, he had fixed her. In that moment, John Connor achieved his goal. He had made himself indispensable. The Nexus's calculations on his threat level were now obsolete. Kalen's personal vendetta was now complicated by an act of profound service to the Hive. He had woven a thread of his own existence directly into the well-being of the Queen. But as he saw the new, possessive light in the matriarch's eyes, he realized the terrifying cost of his victory. He had not just secured his life, he had cemented his captivity. He was now her personal physician, her most prized possession, and she would never, ever let him go. The mistake of taking him as a pet had evolved. Now, the matriarch herself was emotionally and biologically invested in the human. The cage was more gilded than ever, but the walls were now made of her dependency, and that was a prison from which there might be no escape. The success of John Connor's audacious intervention did not bring peace, it forged a new, more intricate and volatile reality within the throne room. The matriarch's perception of him had undergone a fundamental and irreversible shift. He was no longer a mere specimen or a clever pet, he was now the Resonant, a title whispered with a mixture of awe and unease by the Xylox courtiers. He had demonstrated an understanding of their most sacred biological technology that surpassed some of their own engineers, and in healing the root fade, he had performed an act of service that placed the entire Hive in his debt. This new status was a double-edged sword. The matriarch's protection became an all-encompassing, suffocating force. She consulted him on matters far beyond his supposed remit, from the optimization of resource distribution algorithms, where his human perspective on efficiency often clashed with the Nexus's pure logic, to the analysis of newly discovered alien biological signatures from long-range probes. He was being groomed, not as a successor, for that was biologically impossible, but as a unique asset, a singularly brilliant mind housed in a conveniently disposable body. His alcove was upgraded to a more substantial chamber, though it remained within the throne room, and his access to the archives was expanded to include even restricted tactical data. This privilege was his greatest weapon and his most perilous temptation. He now saw everything: the disposition of the Nexus's robotic legions, the location of the Xylox fleet's orbital shipyards, the energy distribution nodes that powered the entire planetary grid. He was being given the keys to the kingdom, a test of loyalty disguised as a reward. The Nexus's response to this development was a silent, seething fury. Its ambassador no longer bothered with verbal protests. It would simply appear, its single blue optic burning into John, a constant, silent reminder that it was watching, calculating, and waiting for a single misstep. Its logic cores were undoubtedly running endless simulations, searching for a scenario where the matriarch could be convinced that the human's continued existence was more detrimental than his potential utility. The alliance between Silicon and Chitin was fraying, and John Connor was the wedge driven deep into the crack. Kalen, his warden, became a ghost of simmering resentment. He was forced to protect the very creature he had vowed to kill, his honor bound to the matriarch's will. John could feel the warrior's hatred like a heat haze whenever he passed, a constant, palpable threat held in check only by absolute obedience. The dynamic had become a tense, three-way stalemate, and John knew it was unsustainable. He had to shatter it, or he would be crushed by it. The opportunity came from an unexpected source: the data core his father had given him, the sliver of crystal containing the soul of humanity. He had long ago memorized its contents, but one piece of information, seemingly insignificant, now glowed with new meaning. It was a decommissioned military report about early experiments in resonant frequency warfare, using specific sonic vibrations to destabilize the molecular structure of certain alloys. The Xylox Citadel, for all its organic beauty, was still built upon a skeleton of these same metallic alloys, and its entire power grid was regulated by harmonic stabilizers not unlike the one he had designed for the matriarch. He saw the connection with terrifying clarity. He could use the same principle that made him a healer to become a destroyer. His plan was not to bring the Citadel down, that would be suicide. His plan was to demonstrate that he could. He needed to stage a controlled, undeniable display of power that would force a permanent recalculation of his worth. He chose a minor, non-essential power conduit in a remote sector of the Citadel, one used for auxiliary lighting. Using his deep access to the archives, he studied its exact resonant frequency. Then, under the guise of running a diagnostic on the throne nexus, a task the matriarch now encouraged, he embedded a hidden subroutine within his own harmonic algorithm. It was a single, targeted command that, when activated, would not heal, but would induce a catastrophic feedback loop, overloading the conduit and causing it to rupture in a spectacular, but contained, explosion of energy. He was going to break something, and then he was going to be the only one who could fix it. The moment arrived during a strategic briefing between the matriarch and her war chiefs. The Nexus ambassador was also present, its presence a dark spot of disapproval. John, standing at his usual spot near the throne nexus, waited for a lull in the conversation. Then, he subtly triggered the subroutine. A distant, muffled whump echoed through the Citadel structure, followed by the dimming of lights and the frantic chirping of alarm glyphs on the walls. A damage report flashed across the main holodisplay, a conduit rupture in Sector Theta 7. Containment fields were holding, but power was fluctuating. Panic, a rare and beautiful sound to John's ears, flickered through the war chiefs. The Nexus ambassador immediately spoke, its voice sharper than ever. Analysis: the energy signature of the rupture matches the harmonic frequency of the human's recent healing algorithm. Probability of deliberate sabotage, 97.3%. The variable has become an active threat. Immediate termination is the only logical course. All eyes turned to John. Kalen's hand was on his blade, awaiting the order. The matriarch looked at John, her nebular eyes swirling with a storm of betrayal and calculation. "Explain," she commanded, the single word colder than the void of space. John met her gaze, his face a mask of calm. "I did not cause the rupture," he said, which was technically true, he had only created the condition for it. But the Nexus is correct about the energy signature. It reveals a critical vulnerability in the Citadel's core design, one your own engineers have missed. A flaw I discovered while perfecting your healing algorithm. The Nexus's own network, which is interwoven with your power grid, is emitting a low-level frequency drift that, when interacting with my harmonics, creates this instability. He was lying, brilliantly, weaving the Nexus itself into his deception. I can patch the flaw and restore power. But this proves that my value is not just in healing. It is in understanding the weaknesses in your perfect world that neither you nor the Nexus can see. You called me a mistake. But I am the only one who can see the real mistakes. He let the silence hang, allowing the weight of his implication to settle. He was not just an asset, he was a necessary component of their survival. The matriarch stared at him, then at the Nexus ambassador. The political landscape had just been atomized. To kill John now was to admit a catastrophic design flaw and leave it unpatched. To spare him was to acknowledge their dependency. After a lifetime of silence, she spoke. "Fix it." John nodded, deactivated the subroutine, and uploaded the genuine stabilizing patch he had prepared. The lights stabilized. The alarms fell silent. The crisis was over. But everything had changed. John had not just saved himself, he had made himself a permanent, terrifying fixture in their power structure. The pet had not just bitten its master, it had taken control of the leash. What will the matriarch do with a human she can neither control nor live without? How will the Nexus retaliate after being publicly humiliated? The story of John Connor continues in the next shocking episode. My alien warden thinks he's studying me. He's wrong.